Let me turn now to our first keynote speaker, and I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister of Canada. Very, very good to see you here.
Nice to be with you, Bronwyn. Sorry that I'm not there in person. I have to be at question period in a few hours in the House of Commons, so.
I think we are aware of and respectful of political pressures. And let me just say a few things by way of introduction. I was looking down at the large number of things, deeply impressive things that Chrystia Freeland has done, and just wanted to pull out some. She was, of course, first elected as the Member of Parliament for Toronto Centre in 2013, but then elected as Member of Parliament for University Rosedale in 2015, re-elected in 2019 and 2021. We are skipping through some of the liveliness of Canadian politics in this time. And served as Canada's Minister of Trade, of International Trade, overseeing the successful negotiation of Canada's free trade agreement with the European Union at that time. And then as Foreign Minister, also successfully concluded the renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement between Canada, the US, and Mexico. And she has been, in her time in these ministerial posts, not hesitating in bringing forward principles where she feels that those are absolutely central, including principles of human rights, and she has been absolutely central to this particular debate where Canada has taken a lead. So, Minister, let me start by saying this question that we're addressing today of whether or not to repurpose sanctioned Russian assets is going to be a key one for the G7 summit in June. What are you hoping for from that meeting?
OK, alors, Bronwyn, ça me fait un tellement grand plaisir d'être avec vous aujourd'hui. Merci beaucoup et merci pour le rôle clé que Chatham House joue et a joué. And it is, I just have to say to everyone, it's a special pleasure for me to be doing this with Bronwyn, because we actually used to work together at the FT when we were, it feels like only a few years ago, but maybe a little longer than that. Bronwyn, I'd like to start, if you allow me, by reminding us all, kind of situating this in terms of what are the stakes. And I think sometimes we can move into the technical discussion right away and lose sight of what is happening here. And so I'll just make 3 points really quickly. First one is Ukraine has been and is magnificent, and we should be really grateful to them. They have done a much better job than anyone thought before the full-scale Russian invasion. And in being so strong, so united, and so successful at pushing back Russia, they really have saved the rules-based international order, and they really have shown that democracies can fight back. That is hugely valuable to all of us, and they are continuing that fight. And I think sometimes we sort of frame this as, you know, the Ukrainians asking for help, and then we give them a little bit of help, and then they really thank us. I think we need to flip that around and realize, you know, our soldiers are not there dying on the front lines. It is only Ukrainians who are fighting and dying, and they really are fighting our fight. So that's my sort of first point I'd like us to all have in our minds. Second point is, I think the principle of aggressor pays is incredibly powerful and incredibly important. It is outrageous what Russia has done. This is an illegal, criminal war, entirely unprovoked, which is costing all of us a great deal. It is, you know, they're destroying swaths of Ukraine, killing so many Ukrainians, and hurting us too, hurting our countries, hurting our economies. I'm the finance minister. I can talk to you about, you know, the economic impact of this war and how it has been felt by our people across all of our countries who may feel they're pretty remote from the Ukrainian front line, but are feeling it when they go to the grocery store to fill their cars up with gas. And it is not only right, it is necessary that we say clearly to the Ukrainians, to the Russians, and to our own people, aggressor pays. That is where the cost needs to be borne, and we shouldn't feel any need to shilly-shally around that. Third thing I'll say, Bronwyn, and Lloyd has talked about this already, Canada has been thinking along these lines really from the very outset of the war. And we recognized that the economic aspects of this were going to be important. And so we were very early in amending our own domestic legislative framework to allow the confiscation and the seizure of Russian assets. Lloyd has pointed to that. I'm glad we've done it. And I would urge all of us to get our legal frameworks in place. I think we've seen some real progress there with in the U.S. And I do want to recognize the role that Lloyd has played, the role that Alan Rock, a Canadian former justice minister, has played, the role that Senator Ratna Omidvar, that's like our House of Lords, we have a Senate. She has been playing a really leading role here, the role that Fenn Osler-Hampson has been playing. We have a real kind of a real team that has been working on this. And I do want to also talk about Chatham House has been playing a leading role. I do want to say Philip Zelikow, Bob Zellick, and Larry Summers have been doing some important work in laying the intellectual groundwork. And then just the final thing I want to say, Bronwyn, maybe moving into a more direct answer to your question. I think you're right. I think this conversation is timely because I do think the G7 Leaders Summit has the potential to make real progress on this specific issue. From my perspective, what we should be thinking about in terms of what we want to achieve is three things. One, get some money for Ukraine. It's really important. It's not just like a philosophical, theoretical thing. That is a real limiting factor. Two, I think we collectively need to win back the initiative. This is Stanley Cup season in Canada, so there's lots of hockey games being played, and there are lots of debates around what's more important, to play defense well or to play offense well. I think right now we, the G7, need to move into a strong offensive game, and we need to show Putin that we have the capacity to do this. When I look at what are the options on the table for us to do that, it seems to me that these sovereign Russian assets is the place where we can make a meaningful move. But then the final thing that I would say that is a consideration is unity of the allies is really important. I think we have surprised Putin and we have surprised ourselves in the G7, and I would even go a little bit further and kind of say the non-geographic West. We have been remarkably united on this issue, and it is important to maintain that unity.
Thank you very much for that and for giving us just such a wide sweep of what Canada has done and bringing us back to the G7 in June. As I mentioned, just sticking on the G7, but I'm going to pick up some other things you said. So you said that, the most important thing, the thing you want, is to get money for Ukraine now. How close do you think the different members of the G7 are to that now? Because June is not very far away.
I am cautiously optimistic, Bronwyn. I think that I think there is a collective recognition of the importance of all the points that I've just made. I think quite naturally, different countries have different concerns and sensitivities. And while Canada has a clear position and a clear point of view, part of acting in a united way means really taking seriously the concerns and sensitivities of our partners. And I will say, like, I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be part of this conversation. And Canada is privileged to be playing a role in conversations like this one with our G7 partners. We also do recognize that we approach this from a position of relative safety. And, that's one of the reasons that we do really think about the sensitivities and the greater exposure of many of our partners.
You said a lot about why Canada cares, but I want to, if you could just expand for a moment on why you have led a lot of this, why you care and why you have encouraged Canadians generally to care about this issue and make the arguments so strongly and be the first to take such a step in legislation.
Well, Bronwyn, I would actually say it's less about me and more about Canadians. We have some political differences even around this issue in Canada, but I would say actual Canadian people are very clear in the centrality of this issue and the importance of supporting Ukraine. It is hard for me. It rarely does a day pass that someone doesn't come up to me, like on the sidewalk, in an airport boarding lounge, and either say, that's great what you're doing on Ukraine, or more often, that's good, but Canada needs to do more. So there is like a strong public feeling. What I would say that it is so important for us collectively to keep in mind, and I do think Canadians recognize, is the value of and also the fragility of democracy in the world and the rules-based international order. And I think we collectively, in weighing the risks and rewards of particular moves, I think we're quite good as a polity, in conversations like a Chatham House conversation or around a G7 table, in really going through the risks of any particular measure to support Ukraine. I think we need to pay a little more attention to the risks of not supporting Ukraine, to the counterfactual of what happens if Ukraine were to lose, which I think we cannot allow. And thank goodness the Ukrainians are such great warriors and they understand the stakes. But I think we need to kind of remember, had Ukraine failed in those terrible early weeks of the spring of 2022, were Ukraine to fail now and were Putin to win, I think we would be inaugurating a whole era of the decline of democracy and the triumph of authoritarian regimes. You guys are a lot closer to the Russian border than I am here in Canada. It would also reverberate beyond that. And I think we would see, if Ukraine were to lose and Russia were to win, a sort of much more muscular approach taken by authoritarians around the world. And I think we would also see inside our own countries a weakening of democracy and a weakening of belief in democracy. So I think the stakes are really, really high. The price of losing is really, really high. And then on the other side, the value of Ukraine having a clear and decisive victory, of Putin clearly being the loser, of this not having worked, that's also huge. I think that you know, would have a huge deterrent effect on other would-be aggressive, militarily aggressive, authoritarian leaders. I think it would also just be a shot of adrenaline for all of our democracies and remind our own people, yeah, you know what? Democracy can actually do it. Both like the great Ukrainians, but also that we, their friends and allies, have been able to remain united, take some risks, and give them the support they need to do the job.
Thanks for that. And while, as I said before, there isn't a Chatham House line on any issue, the arguments you've just made are ones shared by many of our experts here. They've made them very, very passionately, as have you. So let me ask you what you say to the two counter-arguments against repurposing these assets. I'm pausing a bit over the word repurposing, which seems a actually marvellous euphemism, but taking these assets for Ukraine. One argument is, look, it's illegal in international law, and yes, Russia has flagrantly broken international law in invading Ukraine twice, but one only weakens international law by breaking another part of it. And then the second part would be, and Korean sets all of these out, but the other one that he leads on, this jeopardizes the international financial system and the trust, the willingness of countries to put their assets in dollars, or indeed in euros, because they may fear that they may not get those assets back. And that could push up everyone's interest rates and cost of doing all kinds of things. And so those two, there are others, and I'm sure this afternoon we're going to explore that. But these are the two challenges to the very passionate argument that you have made.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bronwyn. And I think you're right. Those are the two big concerns we have to wrestle with and be satisfied with our answers to in order to move forward. And I do think we need to take them seriously. I think the case for supporting Ukraine is overwhelmingly strong, but that doesn't mean that I think we have the right to be in any way dismissive of serious concerns raised about what we do and how we do it. On the legal arguments, I am not a constitutional lawyer. I'm not any kind of lawyer. And I think you're going to have lots of legal experts participating in the conversation. What I will say is it's something that we take very seriously in Canada, and we've taken seriously in our approach to this. After all, the point here is to defend the rules-based international order, so it's important to do it properly. I have been satisfied by the views of Canadian and international experts that this action would fall well within international law, that there is precedent, and that it would be justified. But I'm going to leave it there. On the financial system point, I do think you've put the arguments in the right order. I think we need to be satisfied that there is legal justification before proceeding to the next question. And I think a positive answer to the financial system question is very much strengthened by being confident we're acting on a strong legal foundation, which I am confident we are doing. Having said that, and acting as I believe we would be on a strong legal foundation with real precedent, and I think I'm right that Philip Zelikow is going to be speaking. He has some personal experience of the legal precedents, and has been an important kind of consultant and advisor to me in Canada. So if you're confident of the strength of that legal precedent, and crucially, provided that there is unity of action and therefore unity of risk sharing among the Democratic allies, I have real confidence in the robustness of our financial systems. This would not in any way be a sort of eccentric, non-thought through action that we would be taking. This is something that we would be taking as a result of extensive debate within our countries and internationally. And crucially, Bronwyn, after the breach of the most fundamental rule for the rules-based international order, which is you don't invade another sovereign country and try to annex its territory and take it over. That's not a complicated rule that our international order is based on. We've been pretty good as an international community at following it, and it has been the basis, a fundamental basis of the sort of post-World War II, era of peace, prosperity, and growth, certainly for the non-geographic West. And, what I would say to your kind of final financial concern of, will countries not feel safe, say, holding their assets in Canadian dollars, holding their assets in Canadian bonds? I would say, as long as you are not behaving in the egregious, criminal, international order rules breaking way that Putin has behaved, you're totally fine. And I would conclude, Bronwyn, by saying sending that message to countries and asset holders that wish to benefit from the stability that our economies, which means our people, have created in a system of international currencies, in a system of central banks, in a system of international cooperation to keep the international financial system, solvent and viable. If you want to participate in that and benefit from it and have your countries benefit from that prosperity, then I think saying you can only participate in that, you can only safely hold your assets in Canadian dollars as long as you don't invade somebody else in a criminal act, I don't know. I think that's a pretty good deterrent effect to have and an entirely reasonable price of entry. And turning the argument around, do we actually kind of want to say, yeah, we'll have foreign ministers, tut, if you invade other countries and break these most fundamental of rules, but we think it's totally fine that you hold your money in our central banks.
Well, thanks for addressing those, and that's very much going to be the subject of this afternoon as people throw themselves at these 2 points and at some of the others. Let me ask you how important you think it is that a reparations process starts right now. We're still in the middle of a hot war, one of the hottest going at the moment, and people might argue that the cost of rebuilding Ukraine and an estimate, very big numbers around already, from 500 billion to double that. Shouldn't that wait till the end of it? How important do you think it is to look at that right now?
I'm going to say 2 things about that, Bronwyn. The first is, from my perspective, from day one, the single most important thing, actually not even day one, from day minus 1, because I think this was something that we have quite rightly needed to focus on from well before the Russian invasion, which was signaled very clearly. I think we need to keep our eyes on the prize, on the main question, which is Ukraine has to win and Putin has to lose. And that has to be, not just 100% of our focus, it has to be 1,000% of our focus. Second thing I would say, though, is, and I sort of tried to say this at the beginning, talking about how we should be grateful to Ukraine, not the other way around. A thing that I think is so important is to have at the center of our discussions Ukrainians, what they are doing, what they need. And something that I actually find quite uncomfortable is the number of discussions I find myself participating about this where the Ukrainians are not in the room. And we really collectively need to be avoiding that. Why do I say this in connection with this question? I think we need to ask the Ukrainians, what do you need? What do you need to win the war? And to what extent do you need today to say to yourselves, we're going to win, and then we're going to have a great country and a safe and prosperous future. We're going to be a successful, viable state with a path to EU membership. And certainly what I hear from Ukrainians, but again, I think you have Ukrainians participating, and I would love to hear their answers on this. But what I hear when I talk to Ukrainians in Ukraine, Ukrainian leaders in Ukraine, is how important it is for them to win the war and also to have a clear, realistic, and positive vision of how Ukraine is going to look after the war. And I can see the value of that. And if that is what, I think we need to listen to the Ukrainians on that point and support them on that point. Because, let's remember, here we are having important, but candidly very technical conversations in a very comfortable environment about some important but quite technical points of law and concerns about reserve currencies, their stability, bond markets, etc. What the Ukrainians are talking about right now is my 25-year-old kid going to go fight on the front lines and have a pretty good chance of dying in the next year? Am I going to go volunteer and have a pretty good chance of dying? Maybe my dad has died. Maybe my kid has died already. And none of us. This is a war for democracy, and it is only Ukrainians who are fighting and dying. And so we really need to attach an extremely high value to their perspectives on this. And what it takes for them to keep going.
Absolutely, and thanks for bringing us back to that question of Ukrainians right now and the choices they're facing. Let me ask you whether you're concerned about the risk that money going in now, if it was coming in reparations or in assets that were repurposed, might be misused by corruption. It was a problem in Ukraine to some extent before the war, and then you have the whole chaos of war and what it does to institutions on top of that.
Look, I am now a minister in a G7 country. I know how careful you need to be when spending the people's money, and how hard and challenging procurement is, how hard and challenging infrastructure building is. It's really difficult to get it right. And every single country represented in the conversation that you're leading, Bronwyn, will inevitably have examples in their own country of mistakes being made and actions needing to be corrected, and Canada is no different. So I certainly think we should not be expecting of the Ukrainians well, let me frame that differently. We should recognize they're a government just like our governments, and perfection is an impossible standard for any country, let alone a country in the midst of war. I think your question is important, though. It's important for us. It's important for Canadians. You know, we're talking right now about that Russian sovereign assets, but we have asked Canadians to contribute their own money to support Ukraine, and we have been doing that, and we will continue to do that. Part of the deal in doing that is I need to be able to say to Canadians, all of that money is going for the things that we sent it to Ukraine for. So that is important. But at the end of the day, I think the real monitors, the real guarantors of Ukraine spending it, of Ukraine behaving in a democratic, responsible, rule of law way, including in the ways that it spends money that it gets from its allies. The real people who are going to make sure that happens are Ukrainians. And we really need to kind of like we need to not take away agency from Ukraine, and we need to not underrate the power of Ukrainian democracy. Like, let's remember, Ukrainians have now shown, they showed in the Orange Revolution, they showed with the Maidan, that they see what their government is doing a lot more than we do in London or in Ottawa. With Ukrainians right now on the front lines dying and making a choice to go there and maybe die, I think there is a very high level of expectation among the people of Ukraine that their government is going to spend any money it has on the war or on rebuilding. We should be supportive of Ukrainian efforts to hold the Ukrainian government to account. But let's remember, the people who are going to do the best job of that are Ukrainian citizens, Ukrainian journalists, Ukrainian veterans, and let's empower them.
Thank you for that. We're going to have to draw to a close there. You've made the most powerful case for this, as you have steadily, and we're going to discuss all these points this afternoon. Thank you for referring at the beginning to the time where we were both working on the Financial Times, and that's not just passing nostalgia or sentimentality, but it was in the aftermath of the Soviet Union. You were particularly specializing in Ukraine and Russia at that time, and that was one of the things that took me into journalism at that point, the sense of new rules and new order of things being worked out. Still with us. Chrystia Freeland, thank you very much indeed for joining us.